I am ready whenever you guys are.
Yep, I'm ready.
Yeah? All right. Welcome, everybody, to this session all about prioritizing spine hygiene. My name is Adam Youngsman. I'm coming to you all the way from Toronto, Canada.
欢迎各位来参加今天的课程。今天我们会花一节课的时间来聊一聊脊柱的保健。那我是 Adam 目前在加拿大的多伦多。
Now, I'm really excited to be speaking to you. I'm very thankful to everybody who's involved with Idea China, including Lee and our interpreter today, Arthur. And I just want to thank all of them for just putting so much work into putting this conference together so that somebody as far away as Toronto can speak to you about many different topics, but today, spine hygiene.
非常高兴能够给大家做一个线上的分享。那感谢 Idea China 董力以及翻译以及整体的团队为这个课程做出的这个贡献，所以这样可以在一个非常遥远的国家为大家带来一些课程。那今天我们会聊的是关于脊柱的健康。
Now, before we actually get into the session today, I want to just give you a background about what I have done in the past and why this specific topic is so important to me.
好，那正式开始课程内容之前，简单介绍一下我相关的背景也是为什么这个课程非常重要。
So I've been working in rehabilitation since I graduated from university many years ago. And so I've been working in a lot of physiotherapy and chiropractic clinics as a part of the rehabilitation team.
那我在大学毕业之后，很多年之前就在从事这个康复相关的这个工作，在很多诊所以及正骨的这个治疗中心都有参与过这些工作。
So I began my career working in these smaller clinics as a kinesiologist, and I've kind of moved my practice and I've become a strength and conditioning coach. And this is, probably 7 or 8 years ago. And I started to work with a lot of high-level athletes as an individual who works not necessarily in the rehab clinic, but more so gets them from rehab back to high performance again.
所以我的整个经历会从这个诊所里的治疗师慢慢转移我的领域到体能这个领域，所以会接触到很多顶尖的运动员。所以呢，我的整个经历就会变成希望把一个人从康复的这个状态，然后慢慢的去训练到一个最佳的运动表现。所以整个过程我都会有涉及到。
Now, when you look at high-level sport, oftentimes we see the best of sport. We see athletes playing at a really high level that a lot of other people could never have even dreamed of getting to. And they produce a lot of force. They look very efficient. But behind the scenes, what you see is actually a lot of nagging injuries and a lot of underlying soreness and pain.
所以我们表面上看这些顶尖的运动员，他都是非常强健的，表现出很强的能力很快的速度，很大的力量。但实际上，这背后付出的都是很多看不到的受伤，身体上会有酸痛，会有疼痛的出现。
Now, one of the most common areas where we see this pain and dysfunction is actually in the spine. And when you look at a lot of at the research that's been done on these topics, it keeps coming back to the same thing, and that spinal stability and spinal health is vitally important for everything else that you do, specifically when you are looking for high performance.
所以会发现所有的研究都指向一个共同的部位，那就是我们的脊柱。脊柱的健康以及脊柱的稳定性，对于一个高水平的运动表现是至关重要的。
So whether you are a high-level athlete, you work with high-level athletes, or maybe even you're just looking for the best performance in the gym, spine health is very important. The problem for most people is that they don't realize what they're doing or not doing is causing a lot of pain and damage to the spine.
对，无论是你自己是个顶尖的运动员，还是你会带运动员做训练，亦或是在健身房更好的训练成果，都需要更多关注在脊柱的健康上。 因为这个会很大程度决定了你的一个表现。
Now, I'm not sure how many of you have experienced some sort of back pain before, but I myself have dealt with it for a little while. Mine's a little bit different in that it was sport related, and it's actually my SI joint where my pelvis meets my spine that was damaged. But I know how debilitating something like a back injury can be. And so I want to help you, help yourself, and help your clients be better at creating a healthy environment for your spine.
好，所以不知道在看课程的这个同学有多少遭受过这个下背疼痛或者脊柱的疼痛。那我个人来说，因为之前运动相关的经历造成过一个下背痛，那我自己解决的花了一些时间，因为相对来说我的这个疼痛会比较特别，涉及到我的骶髂关节啊，这个连接出了一些损伤，所以会花一些时间去调整。那也希望可以通过我自身的经历加上训练的经验，帮助各位可以去更多改变其他人下背的这个问题。
And so this session is called Prioritizing Spine Hygiene, and I chose the word hygiene very, very specifically. It's not something where I'm just saying prioritize spine health or prioritize good posture, because hygiene in and of itself is a condition or a practice that is conducive to maintaining health and preventing disease. So when we look at the spine and we look at the kind of the risks for damage and disease, we have to make sure that we are putting it in the best position for health.
好，那在课程的选题上，包括用语上，会用到一个保健这样一个词，那没有选择说是提高脊柱健康或者避免受伤，而是更多用动的去为了维持它的健康，并且预防它的一些疾病损伤而做的这些操作。
And so we have things like hygiene for sleep, where we make sure that we don't have cell phones in our bedroom and not electronics. We try to shut the lights off or at least dim them within a couple hours of going to bed. We try to have a regular sleep schedule, and all of these things to help us sleep better and therefore better utilize sleep and its recovery.
所以，比如说，我们举另外一个例子，就是我们希望有更好的睡眠。那我们会刻意的在睡前避免一些电子产品，避免一些让你兴奋的这些事件，所以我们会希望可以在睡前安静下来，拥有更高的睡眠质量。那其实这个也是一样，我们希望的是主动完成一些对我们脊柱更加健康，能够对它起到保健效果的这个行为。
We also have hygiene for our teeth, so oral hygiene, where we brush our teeth once, twice a day, hopefully floss, and all of this trying to prevent disease of the teeth, make our smile nice and white so that we, look good in pictures. But we're always doing this, and we do this consistently every single day, sometimes multiple times a day.
还有一个例子就是，比如说我们的刷牙啊，每天我们会刷牙2次。为了保持我们牙齿的健康，能有个更漂亮的笑容。那这件事儿还有个很重要的是持续性，我们需要每天不断的做这件事啊，才能维持它的一个健康水平。
And now more than ever, we wash our hands all the time. We wash our hands whenever we go to the store and come back, when we need to touch anything that isn't our own, almost always. We're washing our hands before we eat, after we go to the washroom. So consistently trying to remove a lot of the maybe disease-causing microorganisms that might be on our hands in order to prevent disease and maintain health.
今年还会让大家多了一个特别的行为啊，去保护自己的健康，就是我们会更多次数的洗手，也会每次碰到其他物体之后，就会希望洗手去把细菌杀掉啊，避免我们获得这个比如肺炎、新冠肺炎这样一个风险，所以我们会刻意去完成这些，希望避免疾病、避免损伤的一些事情。
So all of these are regular practices that we do in different areas, and there are several other types of hygiene that we undergo every single day. And the key thing to think about here is that while we do all of these every day regularly to prevent disease and maintain health, we should also be looking at doing this with our spine as well, because it needs hygiene too.
所以我们会发现，在生活中的不同领域、不同方向，大家都在做着一些保健的行为，就是持续的有刻意的去完成一些事，为了我们身体可以处在更佳的状态。那除了为了健康以外，我们对我们脊柱也需要这样的一个保健。
Now, before we actually get into these 3 things that we can do to improve spine hygiene, let's actually look a little bit into the why we need spine hygiene first. So what is the kind of anatomy of the spine that puts it at such high risk for damage and pain?
在我们聊具体的为什么脊柱需要做这些事情之前，我们先来分析一下，那脊柱它的解剖上的结构，或者说是什么状态使它处于一个容易受伤、容易出现伤病的这个状态。
So the spine in and of itself goes all the way from the base of your skull all the way down to your pelvis, and it's made up of 33 individual vertebrae or bones. Some of them are fused, some of them are not, but they all interact with each other.
首先，我们的整个脊柱会从你的枕骨一直连接到你的骨盆，由33块椎骨构成。那有些可能数量相对会更少一些，那它们在起着一个非常重要的作用，就是共同协同完成身体的一些运动。
Now, on these bones, where they actually articulate, much like maybe the shoulder would at the glenohumeral joint, there are what are known as facet joints. And these are the areas often that cause a little bit of pain, specifically with end range movements.
那实际上，我们的每个椎骨之间呢，会有点像我们的这个关节一样，会形成一些这个纤维关节。那这些关节通常也会是有的时候我们在一个活动度过大的情况下造成疼痛的这个位置。
So with repetitive end range movement, much like your joints in other areas of the body start to break down, they start to degenerate the cartilage on the facet joints, and therefore they become irritated, they can become inflamed, and you can get diagnosed with something called facet joint syndrome.
所以，当你在经常挑战一些大活动度或者让脊柱做了不正常的屈伸展的情况下，这些关节就会存在一定风险去出现退化。那比如说，它会出现一些损伤，造成炎症。很多时候，这些炎症呢，这个症状就会造成一些脊柱的问题。
Now, some other important structures are the actual intervertebral discs. So these little kind of pie-shaped discs that sit between all of the vertebrae themselves.
那还有一个非常重要的结构，大家可能比较熟悉，就是在两节椎骨之间的这个椎间盘。
Now, these discs serve a lot of different functions. One of the primary ones is helping to absorb force, so they act as a bit of a cushion, but they also enable for nice, smooth motion, and they keep the vertebrae apart to allow for the range of motion that you see all the way through the spine.
椎间盘会有一些很重要的作用，其中第一个就是它有点像气垫一样，可以起到一个缓冲的作用，帮助脊柱维持健康。那还有一个很重要的是，它在两节椎骨之间允许两节椎骨有更大的活动度，所以它确保两节椎骨不会在一起碰撞摩擦，从而可以完成更大幅度的这个屈伸、向侧向的动作等等。
Now, if you were to dissect one of these discs and cut it just in half lengthwise, what you would see is you would see a whole bunch of layers of these cartilaginous rings. So almost think about cutting an onion in half and what you would see when you looked inside.
好，那如果在这个解剖上比如说我们把一些椎间盘去剖开，你会发现它是一层一层不断叠加在一起的，有点像洋葱被切开的这样的一个结构。
Now, in the center of this, what you will actually see is a nucleus, this kind of gel-like fluid that sits right in the center of everything. And that helps to kind of control some of the pressure. It helps to feed the disc itself. But the problem is that as you move towards end range under force, under a lot of load, you start to see that these rings start to come apart and this nucleus starts to fish its way through all of these layers of cartilage.
好，那在椎间盘的中间会有个结构呢，叫做髓核它有点像一个果核这样一个状态，它会起到一个控制整体压力，并且向椎间盘输送这个水分这样一个作用。那如果我们在一个负重的状态下再去挑战脊柱它不太适合的这种大幅度的运动，就有可能造成的是，首先我们外面一层一层的这个包围的组织呢会慢慢向外扩张，那髓核有可能由于被挤压向外去突破了这些一层一层的保护造成一定的这个所谓的突出是有可能出现的。
Now, the problem with a lot of new or young lifters is that they believe that if you have pain, then you've done something wrong. But if you don't have pain, then you haven't done anything wrong yet. And the problem with that is that pain is actually the last signal your body gives you that there's something wrong.
所以很多刚开始练的人或者是比较年轻的训练者会有一个错误的概念，就是当你身体出现疼痛的时候，你会感觉到你可能之前有些事儿做错了，但实际上疼痛是身体给你的最后一个信号，它已经是最后预警。
And when you think about the discs in the spine, the same concept rings true. There are no nerves within the actual disc itself, and so you don't feel that nucleus fishing its way through the layers of cartilage that have delaminated, and you only start to feel it when the disc actually bulges itself and pushes onto a nerve.
所以这个在我们的整个脊柱跟椎间盘这个结构上体现尤为明显，因为椎间盘本身呢没有神经，所以在它被挤压、被一些破坏的时候，它不会感受到疼痛。那你感受到的疼痛，其实已经说明你的椎间盘出现了问题，向后突出压迫到了神经这个时候才会有疼痛的信号传递上来。
So much in the same way that we brush our teeth in order to prevent our teeth from falling out or getting cavities and pain, we should be thinking the same way about our spine. Instead of trying to just react and think, well, now my back hurts, so I'll go start doing things that are good for it, we should actually start looking at the spine in a way to think, hey, how do I prevent pain from actually starting in the first place? And how do I improve the overall health so that I maybe never get pain?
所以希望各位能够建立一个非常重要的意识，就是我们像刷牙一样，你不会等到蛀牙出现，牙已经掉了才开始刷牙。我们需要的是通过每天来预防这件事儿，但要见疼痛才想着我该怎么去治疗，怎么去康复，而是应该通过每天对脊柱进行保健保养，来避免出现一些不想看到的疼痛。
And so today what we're going to do is we're going to look at 3 primary areas that you can use either for yourself or for your clients to help improve the hygiene and the health of your spine, to help prevent disease or dysfunction, and also perhaps even to aid in recovering from some current back pain that you have.
所以今天我们会从3个这个角度来聊一聊，应该如何帮助自己、帮助你的客户去避免下背出现受伤。如果你
So we're going to look at our will reduce the pain we have in our lower back and stiffness, and we'll talk about why that's important. And then we'll get into optimizing lifting mechanics. So how can we not only set a firm foundation with some spinal stability exercises, but then how can we prepare the actual position of our spine for optimal health when we're lifting?
好，所以我们会从3个角度来做到这件事儿。第一个是关注在你的整个姿势跟姿态，无论是站姿还是坐姿，我们都会有对脊柱更友好的一个方式。那第二个呢，是在日常活动、日常生活中，我们是否可以增加一些动作？这些动作可能会对于我们的脊柱健康有积极的这个帮助。第3个是我们不光对 这个脊柱进行一些常规的训练，希望它能够稳定。更多是我们在真正训练、在负重的时候，应该用到一个正确的发力机制，来确保它在训练时也处在最佳的这个状态。
All right, so let's take a look now and see perhaps how we can improve some of our spine hygiene through proper posturing. So let's talk first about posture and the spine to begin with. Now, when we look at somebody from a side angle, this is often the way that we look at spine posture, and we're looking at all of the curves in the spine. So what I want to do is walk through these curves and then talk about some common dysfunctions that we might see and how we can maybe address some of those.
好，首先我们先就第一个这个姿态的话题进行展开。那我们通常会从侧面去看一个人来判断他整个脊柱的一个状态。因为我们脊柱会有一些自然的曲度，那接下来我们会来依次聊一聊这些曲度以及可能会出现的一些功能是丧失，并且如何去调整这些功能丧失。
All right, so I'm just going to bring Jen out here for a second, and we're just going to walk through some posturing stuff. All right, so actually, I'm going to bring you a little bit closer so we can actually see the spine here. All right, just going to bring a bit closer here. So when we're looking at the spine, we should know that there are two primary ways or directions of curve.
好，接下来我们请我的搭档 Jane 一起帮大家去理解一下我们的脊柱的一个状态。首先，我们脊柱会有两个自然的这样一个曲度。
So when we're born with one curve, right? We are in an entirely flexed position. This is the way babies are. They're very fragile in this position, and their body really hasn't started to solidify any of the joints, the ligament length, the muscle tensions, and it just doesn't have the motor control with regards to posture in order to maintain curves at that point.
好，那这个会聊到我们其实婴儿在刚刚出生的时候都会是只有一个曲度就是一个类似 C 型这样一个脊柱状态，它没有很好的这个关节、韧带的强度以及肌肉的张力，所以它没有能力去维持脊柱的曲度。在这个状态下婴儿的脊柱是非常脆弱的。
So the flexed curves in our spine, which include our thoracic spine, and then as well as our sacrum and coccyx in and around the pelvis, those are two what we call primary curves because they've been there since birth.
好，所以这个曲度呢，会随着我们的生长发育，最终保留两个部位。第一个部位呢是胸椎段，所以会是一个向前屈曲的状态。那还有一个呢，会是我们的骶骨这个位置，跟骨盆的连接这块，同样会保留这样一个曲度。所以这两个曲度我们会称为是一个原始的曲度。
Now, through the first year of life, what we begin to see is that the neck starts to develop what we call a lordotic curve, so an extended curve. And then the lower back, a little bit later on, starts to develop into a lordotic curve as well. And those are called our secondary curves.
好，随着我们在婴儿1岁之内发生的一些动作的变化，慢慢它会由于功能会产生两个后天的曲度。一个曲度呢，就是我们的颈椎会从之前的这个屈曲状态变成一个反弓状态，所以整个曲度是向前的。那跟这个一样呢，还有我们的腰椎段曲度也会是向前。
Now, every client is going to be a little bit different with how they express these curves, and it's going to have to do with static posture. It could have to do with maybe wearing high heels as a female to an office. It could have to do with extended sitting and standing, or perhaps even sport and repetitive movements that they have performed throughout their life.
所以你会发现客户的这个曲度状态都不太一样，可能由于他的整个动作发育身体发育的过程，或者是他会习惯穿高跟鞋，会习惯长期站立，或者是他的从事的运动会给他产生一些脊柱曲度的这个变化。
So some of the most common postures that we see all revolve around pelvic position and then therefore thoracic position. So one of the most common ones is where we see an anterior pelvic tilt, the hips kind of go forward and then the spine comes back. So we see almost like this sway back kind of position where the hips push forward and they lean back, right? So we see a lot of lordotic curve, and then we see excessive kyphosis up at the top because your body is trying to maintain center of mass.
所以这个曲度的变化通常都会出现在两个部分啊，第一个部分是骨盆，第二个部分呢是胸椎。所以刚刚让 Jane 演示的呢叫做摇摆背，就是我们的骨盆会出现一个明显的前倾，那同时呢会出现一个肋骨外翻的状态，那身体会为了保持平衡会出现一个上身向后，整个身体躯干会相对下肢靠后的状态。
The other thing that we see as well is a flat lower back. So we actually see that the back flattens out. They get some more kyphosis to try to even everything out. And then they have this forward head posture as well. And so you excessive amounts of curve in the cervical spine as well.
另外一种比较常见的体态，就像 Jane 刚刚演示的，它会出现一个骨盆的后倾，所以整个腰椎段的曲度会变平。那伴随着这个腰椎变平，会使胸椎曲度过大，同时颈椎的一个曲度也会变大，加上一个颈部的前移，所以会变成头在肩的更前方的位置。
So I just want to demonstrate, just for a quick second, the power that the pelvis has at actually controlling the position of the spine above it. Because if you think about the lumbar spine specifically, but this also extends to the thoracic spine and the cervical spine as well, is that the pelvis has the ability to control the position of the spine above it.
对于这个曲度有一个非常重要的关节啊，就是说我们的这个骨盆。骨盆能够通过它的一个旋转来影响到整体向上的曲度。通常我们可能会想到骨盆前后倾对腰椎段有影响，但实际上腰椎段呢处在脊柱的一个部分，它会继续向上影响到胸椎、颈椎以及头部的位置。
All right, so all I want to do is I just want to bring your hands just across your chest there, just so we get them out of the way, so that you can actually see the pelvis. And so all we're going to do is we're just going to roll into anterior pelvic tilt. And I just want you to allow yourself to even everything else. So you see an excessive amount of lordosis, but then the thoracic spine has also started to compensate by bringing everything else forward because it has to even out the load. So you say the lumbar spine rolls in, and then the thoracic spine has to come far further back, and then in order to even everything out, the head comes forward.
所以看到我们只是让 Jane 做了一个主动的骨盆前倾啊，她的腰椎曲度变大。那变大之后，如果她的胸椎没有调整，你会发现她整个上身会变成更前倾。这个时候你无法维持平衡。那人类很自然的一个动作就会变成把你的整个胸椎曲度变大，身体更多的向后靠，出现驼背的一个状态，来平衡这个重心，让身体稳定。
Now, as we bring the pelvis into posterior tilt, in order to even out the load again, right, the hips sway forward, and now you see an even larger curve in the thoracic spine. So you can almost think about the pelvis and lower back, the thoracic spine, and the cervical spine as these alternating gears in the back, that when you change the position of one, the other ones above it have to compensate for the center of mass being in the middle of the feet.
当 Jane 从前倾到后倾之后，大家会观察到整个曲度的变化、胸椎的变化、颈部的变化，所以你基本上可以这样来理解，就是我们整个骨盆的动作会影响到向上。腰椎、胸椎、颈椎整个脊柱的一个曲度变化，因为它们都是在不断的代偿，像是连在一起的一个链锁。
When we're looking at posture, we want to make sure, and this is going to be the same for sitting and standing, which we'll get to the specifics in a second, but what we want to think about is a tall or a long spine. So I just basically want my client to think about pulling the head as close to the ceiling as possible, and you'll see that the entire spine elongates, and it actually starts to decompress some of the vertebrae in there as well.
所以无论是等一下我们聊到的坐姿跟站姿，一个非常重要的概念就是你希望你的客户可以建立这样一个意识，他的头顶上有一根线去把它拉长，整个这个延伸的状态可以减少对每一个椎间盘这个压力，并且让脊柱处在更理想的这个曲度状态。
All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about seating posture for a second here. So I'm just going to grab a chair and we're just going to set it up on the mat.
接下来我们还来看一看坐姿对脊柱的影响。
So I'm just going to get Jen to sit down. Now, actually, before she sits down, let's just talk about how we actually want our clients to sit. So we often can't get them away from sitting, but we can help them improve how they sit, how long they sit, and what they do while they sit down.
好，我们可能无法改变客户久坐的一个生活方式、一个工作方式，但我们可以改变他怎么做和他每次坐多久，来帮他更加的健康一点。
Now, most office chairs are adjustable, so you can change the height of the chair, you can change how far back the backrest is, how much lumbar curve support there is, often how high the back is and how high the arms are. So you're going to want to adjust this or want them to adjust this specifically for their body height. This chair doesn't have any adjustments, so we're just going to have to do the best with what we have here.
好，所以通常办公室的这个座椅啊，如果它具备一点人体工学的特征，那一般来说可以调节。第一个是座椅的高度，这样你可以决定关节角度，然后整个后仰的幅度可以调，后背靠背的高低可以调，手支撑的这个两边的握把高度可以调。所以以上这些都可以帮助它达到一个更舒适的状态。但今天我们的设备有限，只有这样一个椅子，所以我们会在这个椅子上进行一些调整。
So the first thing what I want to point out is that there is a nice little space here underneath the back pad, and that's where your butt is supposed to go. So I want Jen just to sit and put her butt all the way back into the back of that chair. All right, so the butt's going to sit in there, and then she has this curve here, this lumbar curve, and this is going to be the proper sitting posture. I've got a little bit of anterior tilt, I've got good lumbar curve support, and then I have, now preferably we'd want this to go a little bit higher up so I can support the rest of the thoracic spine, but this is reasonable enough for this particular chair.
好，所以对于我们这把椅子来说，那很好的是它在靠垫的下面有一段空隙，那这个空隙呢，应该刚好可以让你的屁股向后靠甚至是过去一点。所以这个时候让 Jane 坐在凳子上。 可以看到它的骨盆会有一点自然的前倾自然前倾，然后臀部可以通过空隙向后靠，整个腰椎段会有一个曲度的承托，那向上会有一部分胸椎被凳子承托了。那更理想的状态是我们的椅背可以更高，把整个胸椎段都托好。
All right, so I'm just going to get Jen just to stand up because I just want to show something that often happens. I'm just going to get you to stand up for a second. So oftentimes what you'll see is clients at the beginning of a shift or of the workday, they'll position themselves really well. You've told them everything that they need to do. They're like, all right, I'm going to sit up nice and tall. Maybe they have one of those fancy ball chairs where they sit on the edge and they can do all these different movements with it. But they're going to sit down in their chair and they're going to be like, okay, I've got really good position right now. And then about, 30 minutes in or so, they're kind of like slouching here. And then about an hour or two later, they're here. And then by the end of the day, they're hanging off the chair, trying to type and finish up what they're doing. And that's often because, one, they haven't reactivated the core or given their postural muscles a rest. But it's also because they haven't gotten up and moved.
所以经常看到一个情况，就是我们的客户在一天刚开始无论是我们今天用凳子，还是一些比较高级的办公椅，他都会做得非常挺拔，非常把自己拉高的状态。那随着半个小时过去了，开始有一点点疲劳，1个小时、2个小时、3个小时，一直到下班，他会慢慢从做一点瘫在地上。那这个问题，第一个呢是有很充分的激活。 第二个是没有意识到他的动作会开始出现了这个变化，所以会随着疲劳慢慢的瘫下去。
Now, when it comes to posture, whether sitting or standing, the postural muscles themselves can only maintain a particular position statically for maybe 5 to 10 minutes before they start to fatigue, and you start to compensate by going into a more bony, stable position, but a less optimal posture when you're sitting and standing.
所以这个过程是非常正常的，因为无论是坐姿还是站姿，那在一个固定的姿态下，如果我们保持静态， 那最多也就是5到10分钟，我们所有深层维持姿势的这些肌肉都会出现疲劳。那疲劳之后呢，我们会更多依赖身体骨性的结构或者是韧带的拉力来维持一个更轻松的位置。
So in order to prevent ourselves from developing that really slouched posture throughout our day, what we're going to do is we're going to work on, one, I'm going to show you how to activate the core in the sitting position, as well as we're going to start to integrate some movement every 15 to 20 minutes throughout the day when we are sitting, so that we don't have those postural muscles start to fatigue and find ourselves into this rounded, flexed posture.
也给到大家2个策略，第一个是我们会教会各位如何激活核心，第二个是那我们会每15到20分钟做一些调整的动作，避免维持姿势的肌肉疲劳。
So I'm going to go through these instructions for activating the core in just small little pieces, just because I want you to be able to follow along without me having to ramble too much. So the first thing is I just want you, hopefully you're sitting in a chair by now, but I just want you to just assess the activation of your core while you're in that sitting position.
所以我们接下来会尝试依次给出指令，让大家完成这样一个坐姿的调整啊。所以希望大家在看这个课程的时候也是坐姿，这样我们可以刚好可以感受一下这个教学。
Now, what you should notice is that when you're in this sitting position, the abdominals are relatively soft, particularly if you've been sitting for several minutes. And so the stabilizers, what actually allows for stability and proper posture in the core, has actually started to shut off because the chair is providing all of that support for you.
当你在坐姿的时候，椅子会给你身体重量的这个承托，所以这个时候相对来说，我们整个腹部的肌群处在一个比较放松的状态，慢慢的它就会出现松弛。
So if the abdominals start to turn off, what you'll notice is that instead of maintaining the pelvis and the rib cage in a nice organized position, I start to roll into a flexed posture because that is the next most stable position for me. And it's just what my body is used to, remember, from birth when they were in that fully flexed position.
所以当你的整个核心以及腹部松掉之后，那你会很自然出现就是更多的屈曲。还记得我们在婴儿的时候，它会是一个完整的曲度因为这个时候它的状态是更稳定。
So just having your client maybe squeeze their abdominals isn't quite what we're looking for when we're talking about activating the core. Instead, what we want them to do is we want them to activate it, but in a nice, neutral, tall position, but we want it to be reflexive. So we want it to naturally turn on and then stay on throughout the day.
Sorry, Adam.
So what we want to do is, instead of just having them contract the abdominals to activate our core, we want it to be something that's reflexive. So something that we put the body into a position so it can naturally just turn on the core. And that way it will stay on throughout the day.
Okay. 所以这个跟我们训练中间的这个激活核心或者核心收紧状态不一样，我们不会主动的刻意去绷紧它，而是我们希望把动作调整到一个可以让核心肌群、让腹部肌群自动发力的这样一个状态。
And so for this, what we're going to do is we're going to imagine that there is a piece of Velcro that is attached to the back of the chair, and then a piece of Velcro that is attached to the back of the client's spine.
Sorry, I don't know what is a Velcro. Sorry.
So a piece of stick you can kind of pull apart and put back together again.
Okay.
Yeah, and basically we're going to imagine that there's one that's attached to the back of the client's spine and then one that's attached to the back of the chair.
Okay.
So they're basically stuck on the chair right now.
所以我们需要想象的是，我们的客户的后背上以及我们的凳子上分别有2片的这个可以连接的这个位置。所以我们需要的是，现在这2个完全是粘在一起的。
All right, and so what the client is going to do is they're going to maintain a nice long spine position, so really pushing that head towards the ceiling. And then from this position, they're going to start to, while maintaining a nice flat back, just pull themselves gently off the chair. And they still want to be able to feel the chair behind them. But in this position, they're going to hold it for about 8 to 10 seconds, but they should be able to feel now that the abdominals have fired on in this position to help pull them off.
好，那我们需要做的调整是这样。现在我们需要在客户在一个脊柱拉长良好的状态下呢，将身体略微做一点前倾做一点前倾，他仍然可以感受到椅背在后面，但是这个时候没有直接的接触，8到10秒钟，你就会感受到你的核心激活起来了。
So after they've pulled off just a little bit so they can still feel the back of the chair, but they're now activating, they're going to hold it, as I said, for about 8 to 10 seconds, and then they're going to slowly relax themselves back into the chair, and they should still be able to feel that the abdominals are still turned on in that position. And this will be maintained for about 4 to 5 minutes or so. So you're going to have them do this every 5 minutes while sitting down.
好，所以我们需要做的操作就是通过向前倾，让核心发力的这个状态，让你的整个腹部激活。那激活之后呢，我们可以继续向后靠，再次靠回到椅背上。但这个时候他们会维持这个状态4到5分钟。那接下来如何去保持一个长时间良好的状态呢？就是我们需要每4到5分钟向前倾一点点，让核心发力，然后再次靠回来。
The best part about this is if your client is sitting maybe in a meeting and they can't make a lot of noise, they can't get up, stand up, and move, they can still maintain posture and spinal stability without disrupting everybody else. People probably won't even know that they're doing anything.
那这个操作的好处就是，假如说你的客户在开会，他不能站起来或者不能走动，做我们后面教的一些调整方式，那这个动作可以让大家在毫无察觉的情况下，确保他的核心处在一直的激活状态。
Now, if they have been sitting for a long period of time, we have to understand the different muscles that are going to start to tighten in this position and maybe put some stress onto the spine, as well as understand that there's a lot of compression going on. And we're going to talk more about compression and decompression specifically in the next slide. But I want them still to be able to get up every 15 to 20 minutes, if possible, to get a little bit of a movement break during their day.
好，那么下面一步就是在长时间坐姿下，即使我们维持了核心的这个张力，那同样会有些肌肉出现紧张，这个紧张可能给你的腰椎带来更多的压力，包括还会有这个向下的这个施压。那向下的施压，包括以及如何缓解这个压力，我们在后面会进一步的讨论。所以现在我们希望的是可以每15到20分钟，如果条件允许，让它起来走动一下，避免肌肉变得过于紧张。
So to help with some movement in this position, I'm actually going to get Jen to stand up. Let's just imagine the chair is still there, but we're going to move it just for visibility. And what I'm going to get her to do is very quickly, once she stands up, she doesn't have to do a whole lot of movement. She doesn't have to jump around or anything. We just want to quickly decompress the spine and get some movement into the joints that are probably a little bit tight, maybe have some muscles that are a bit angry. And so I'm going to get her to bring her hands interlocked over top of her head. She's just going to reach up as high as she can. All right. And this is going to help to decompress a little bit of that lower back.
好，首先我们让他站起来，然后尝试一个双手用力向上推的动作。那这个动作就可以造成把他的整个脊柱压力下降。
The other way that we can do this as well, instead of reaching straight up, is I can actually still have her interlock her hands, but now she's going to reach her hands in front of her and she's going to push her hips backwards. So she's going to reach her hips as far as she can and her arms as far as she can. Her spine's going to decompress because the pelvis is pulling one way and the hands are pulling the other way. She's going to try to still maintain straight knees to get a little bit of a hamstring stretch perhaps, and just a good stretch and reach in that position, and then back up.
除了上推以外，我们可以做的是将臀部向后推，手向前推，做到一个两侧同时的拉力，把脊柱拉长。那同时，如果你能保持膝盖伸直，你可以对你的腘绳也做一点拉伸，这样可以缓解一些这个腰部的压力。
So both of these decompression pieces whether reaching overhead or reaching in front. You can perform these maybe 6 to 8 times. You don't have to hold for more than maybe 2 or 3 seconds. Just a good reach. Let the lats kind of stretch a little bit. Let the hamstring stretch. Get that distance between the hips and the hands. And about 6 to 8 times or so for one of those. You don't have to do both.
好，所以无论你是选择向上还是向前，我们只需要做一个比较充分的6到8次伸展即可。确保的是把你的屁股跟手的距离拉长啊，通过这样一个拉伸动作来缓解一下整个脊柱上的这个压力。
Now, the next thing is if we've got a little bit of decompression, then let's now look at some of the muscles that may be tight from sitting for an extended period. One of them is going to be the psoas major, the Iliopsoas, if you want to think about that runs from the lumbar spine all the way down to the hip. So it's a big hip flexor.
好，那除了这个脊柱上的压力之外，我们再来考虑一下哪些肌肉会缩短。那其中一个最明显的就是我们的腰大肌跟髂肌构成的这个髂腰肌，所以它是从腰椎段连接到前侧的这个髋部，所以它是主要的一个屈髋肌。
So in order to help with that, what we're going to do is we're just going to do the right hip flexor right now. So we're going to bring the right foot back just into a bit of a split stance. It doesn't have to go all the way back like a lunge, because what I'm actually going to get her to do is she's going to posteriorly tilt. She's going to keep this leg straight. So already she should feel, if she squeezes this butt, she should feel a bit of a stretch already. And then this hand is actually going to reach up to the ceiling, and she's going to then rotate away from that, towards that side. So we're going to get a stretch, because remember, it's attached to the spine. So I'm going to rotate the spine away and extend just a little bit to get a good stretch into the front of that hip.
好，所以我们来看一下怎样拉伸右侧的髂腰肌。第一步呢，是我们会将右腿向后撤到一个分立状态啊，不需要做到一个完整的弓步。然后我们会主动做一个骨盆后倾。那还有一个动作呢，就是将手向上伸过头顶，同时呢，将上身向同侧旋转，所以会变成把你的身体转向你的右侧，因为它连接在我们的腰椎段，所以这样是可以把它做到一个拉长的。
So we want to make sure that the pelvis stays facing forward in the same direction as the feet, and then the thoracic spine, that lumbar spine rotate, and then the arm. This is all just trying to get a fascial stretch deeper into the center of that pelvis. Once they've done the one side, you just don't have to hold for a long period of time, maybe 4 to 5 seconds. Then you switch sides and do the same thing on the opposite side, and you repeat 5 times each side.
所以我们需要确保的是骨盆跟脚尖都朝向身体的正前方，然后我们通过骨盆主动的后倾加上胸椎段的旋转来把髂腰肌拉长。那你不需要在一个位置停留4到5分钟，你需要做的就是可以主动去延展做停顿，然后每边重复4到5次。
Now, if you have a little bit more space, or perhaps you're doing this in the gym with a client who's been maybe sitting in a car for the past little bit because they commuted to and from work, you can have them actually go down into a lunging position with the back knee on the ground. So we're just going to bring this back knee to the ground. And so the same thing can be done here, but now we're going to have even more of that rectus femoris come up, because now the quadricep is tightened, and I'm going to have a little bit more control of that pelvic position. So same thing, I'm going to squeeze into that glute, I'm going to reach up as high as I can, and then I'm going to rotate away from that side. Right? So really trying to get a good stretch. So this is another alternative to that same stretch, depending on how much space you have and what your environment is like.
好，所以如果你客户有比较大的空间啊，或者是他刚刚开车回家，在通勤上花了很多的时间坐姿，你可以采取下面这个动作。我们会用一个弓步姿势，同样保持臀部夹紧，骨盆后倾，然后完成一个拉伸。那与刚刚的动作相比呢，可能多了更多的是股直肌的拉伸，因为这个时候我们把整个股直肌给拉长了。
All right. And then the last thing that I'm going to show you is another big muscle that's often tight is the piriformis muscle. So the piriformis muscle attaches from the sacrum, so right by the sacroiliac joint, and then runs across and attaches to the femur, and it's responsible for some external rotation. So often in these positions, feet are open, specifically if we're driving, and that can really tighten up that muscle. And then we lose internal rotation. We may get some sacroiliac joint pain, which is pain that often radiates to one side of the pelvis or the other. And so I'm going to show you a stretch for that muscle as well.
好，那下一个拉伸的一个很大的肌肉是我们的梨状肌。那么梨状肌呢，从我们的坐骨一直连接到连接到股骨，所以它主要的功能是产生一个髋部外旋的能力。那很多时候，如果你长期开车一直处在外旋的状态，或者是你丧失了内旋功能，都会造成这个梨状肌出现紧张，造成一些这个类似坐骨神经痛这样的问题，因为它的紧张会压迫到这个神经。
And so for this stretch, because we're at most likely an office or at home, the easiest thing to do is just to be in this standing position. If you need some extra balance, you can hold onto a wall or a chair. You're going to cross your foot over top of the opposite knee, and then all you're going to do is you're just going to sit down like you're sitting into a chair. Right? You should feel a big stretch in the back of that hip, specifically the one that is bent.
好，所以我们操作的方式很简单，把一侧的脚抬起来，放在另一侧的膝盖上，然后我们会主动的将臀向后推，做一个蹲的动作，你也感受到臀部会有一个明显的拉伸。
Right, so this is a figure four, like a standing figure four stretch or a standing pigeon stretch. Once again, if you have a client who perhaps balance issues, or maybe you've got a lot more space because you're in the gym, you can do this exercise that we just did, this standing figure four stretch. You can actually do it on the floor as well, just as a pigeon pose. I'm just going to get Jen to get into pigeon pose here. And we're just going to have the one leg in front, back leg straight back, and just really trying to get a good stretch into that front hip. Now, sorry, go ahead.
好，如果你的客户他会在单腿拉伸的时候有一些平衡的问题，或者他有足够的空间，那我们可以尝试现在这个动作，让 Jane 坐在这样一个瑜伽垫上，所以一腿在前也在后，所以拉伸一个前侧腿的髋部，鸽子式。
Now, Jen's a lot more flexible than somebody like I am. And if you have either somebody who is really inflexible in the hips, perhaps they don't sit in a cross-legged position all that often, or maybe they have some knee pain, what you can do is we can modify this a little bit to take some of that stress off of the knee.
好，因为 Jane 的柔韧性非常好所以她做这个动作会很轻松。但如果你的客户会比较紧张，或者他会存在一些膝关节的这个问题，那我们不希望他膝关节承受过大压力，我们可以对这个动作做一点调整。
And so what we all do to do that is we're going to have them just rotate to sit onto this hip here. This back leg is still going to be straight back. But now, instead of really driving their entire body to rotate over top of that knee and having their hips perhaps come off the ground, we're going to keep this hip on the ground and just try to drive this ASIS, so the front of this hip, towards almost the heel there, and you should start to feel a stretch in the back of that hip, and that'll take, as I said, that torque, that stress out of that front knee.
所以我们做的调整呢，是会将重心做一点变化，坐在一侧的髋部，所以你的拉伸这一侧呢可以着地，然后我们会通过骨盆的旋转，用对侧的髂前上棘去找你的脚踝的方向，所以会主动旋转骨盆来找到髋部外侧的拉伸。那这个动作可以相对减少一些前侧膝盖的这个旋转的扭矩。
There's one other variation to this. We don't have a box here to do it, but if you had perhaps a 24 or a 30-inch box, you could get them to put their leg on top of the box and then just bend this knee to get a bit of that stretch. And that'll once again take some of that stress off. And for those who maybe don't want to or can't sit on the floor, it'll help them do the stretch seated. So they can use their desk at work.
另外一种选择就是我们可以选择一个60公分到70公分的跳箱，或者是他们办公室的办公桌，把整个腿旋转之后放在桌子上， 然后慢慢的去做这个髋部的拉伸。
Now, sitting for the longest time, most of us know that sitting, period, for long periods of time isn't really all that good for us. And so recently, there's been a big push towards standing as a way to, or a healthier way to work at a desk.
所以现在几乎大家都达成了一个共识啊，就是久坐会对人类会是一个非常影响健康的方式，所以会有一个非常流行的趋势，就是大家都会变成站起来办公。
Unfortunately, standing isn't the solution to sitting if we're still remaining in a static position, simply because any static position held for an extended period isn't great for us. We want to be able to move and really vary our positions throughout the day.
那非常遗憾的是，从久坐变成久站，并不是一个完美的解决方案。因为长期的站姿也会出现一些姿势的偏差，造成一些不良的影响。
So what you'll often see with somebody standing at a stand-up desk is they'll start to develop poor postures where they'll shift weight to one side, they'll lock the knee, they'll lock the hip out, trying to take the stress off of the actual musculature itself from having to hold you. And simply because, once again, much like sitting in that slouched posture, the postural muscles that hold you there are just getting tired and fatigued, even though they may not feel like you're tired or fatigued when you're in the gym.
所以这个跟坐姿一样的问题，就是当你长时间站姿之后，我们会发现一个更省力的模式，通过把髋部向外顶，把膝盖锁定，来维持身体的重量。那这个时候同样会是一个你没有用肌肉的力量去维持，而是靠一些骨性结构、一些韧带的被动拉力去维持你的站姿。
And so this, over time, having these kind of adopted positions where we shift weight from one side to the other, this can eventually lead to things like muscular imbalances. It can lead to poor joint positions, specifically in that lumbar spine. And so we want to make sure that we get into a position that allows us to maintain proper spine posture without having to really move a whole lot so that we can still actually do the work that we need to do.
好，所以同样，当你把一侧的髋部经常向外顶，靠单侧承重之后，出现一些肌肉的失衡，出现一些关节的错位，那也同样骨盆的偏转会造成脊柱曲度的变化。所以我们希望的是，可以在不一直动的情况下，找到一个比较合理的站姿，让它可以长时间的去工作，让肌肉发力。
So one of the ways we can do this, and actually bars have done this fantastically for years, is we can put something underneath the desk where the client can stand and put their foot onto the, I'm using a kettlebell here, but you can put a box or something like that underneath, depending on their height. If they have a kettlebell and want to use a kettlebell, by all means, right? But they can just stand and place their foot up onto this, and that takes some of the stress off of the postural muscles that hold you in that position.
好，一个非常简单的选择，就是在客户的前方放一个小的物体，有一定高度，可以是一个壶铃，可以是个箱子，所以客户可以把一只脚踩在上面。那这个动作呢，可以缓解一些双脚共同站姿状态下的一些压力。
All right, and so with this, you're going to want to make sure that you alternate from one side to the other every maybe 5 minutes or so, or whenever the opposite leg gets a little bit tired. But it just helps to keep the spine in a good, healthy position without putting too much stress into the hip.
这样可以给髋部的压力减小并且确保它每5分钟要去交换一次，让两边得到一个平衡。
So one of my other favorites is actually utilizing a small rubber lacrosse ball in order to relieve some of the tension in the back. And now this may seem like a weird tool, but I'm going to just explain how the nerves in the bottom of the foot are actually connected to the nerves in the back of the foot, or the back, lower back.
一个方式就是用一个硬的这个曲棍球，硬的小球。来缓解它足底的张力，从而通过足底的张力缓解来改善它腰椎整个脊柱的健康。
So if you remember your spine anatomy a little bit, between all of the vertebrae come these nerve roots, which go to different areas in the body. So in and around the lower cervical spine, they go to your shoulders, but the ones into the foot and leg come from that lower back, primarily that sciatic region. And so by actually stimulating the nerves in the bottom of the foot using something like a lacrosse ball, you can actually ease some of the tension and the pain that you might feel in that lower back.
所以，如果你有了解过关于脊柱的一些解剖啊，或一些功能性解剖的话，会发现，那整个椎骨它都会有一个椎孔，这个椎孔呢是确保我们的神经可以从大脑一路向下通过。比如说，我们颈部的神经会控制我们的肩部分的这个动作，那我们控制下肢或者控制我们脚底的神经呢，更多是从下背部、从腰椎这一段向下延伸的。所以，当你通过一个球来刺激了足底的神经的时候，可以得到一个效果，就是下背部的张力会得到释放。
So for a lot of people, specifically those who have back pain, but for most people in general, the bottom of the foot is very, very sensitive. So rolling on something like a lacrosse ball, walking on rocks even, can feel very uncomfortable for them. So you're going to want to vary or allow them to vary how much pressure they put on the ball based on how sensitive the bottom of the feet are.
好，所以我们的一些客户或者说一些下背部有不适的人，可能会在踩球的时候感受到明显的这个酸痛啊，明显的不适感。当他们踩在球上或者踩在一些岩石上的时候，他会非常的敏感。所以这个时候我们可以允许客户自己来控制多少力道，来感受这个不适。
So what I'm going to get Jen to do is we're just going to act as if her desk is in front of her. So she's actually going to walk right up to in line with the lacrosse ball, and she's going to place her foot on top of it. And so she's as if she's typing on that stand-up desk, and she's just moving that ball around underneath her foot, maybe finding a sore area and maybe flexing and extending those toes in and out. And really just trying to find some areas, but all she's doing, much like she was doing with the kettlebell or the step that you might use, she's just putting stress onto one side while kind of working on the muscle in the other.
好，所以我们让 Jane 做的呢是模拟她正在站立办公，在打字。那同时呢，一侧脚会在球上做滚动。当你找到一些比较酸痛的位置之后，可以踩住，做一些脚趾的活动。那这个动作会跟刚刚我们踩在壶铃上会是有个异曲同工之妙，就变成我们单侧的腿会承担支撑的角色，另外一边呢会是在对这边的肌肉、对这边的筋膜进行松解跟训练。
Now, I've actually done this for hours on end in my office, just kind of working around both feet. And the key is that there's no specific amount of time to do it. You do it as long as you feel that you can, that you're not creating more pain in the back or in the foot. And you just switch side to side, maybe every few minutes or so, trying to find those sore areas. If you can maybe even try to like put a bit more pressure on it, maybe even try to stand on it eventually. And you'll feel just different sensations traveling up through the leg and into the spine.
所以我个人会经常采取这样一个方式，就是一边办公一边脚下踩球，来回交替。那你可能会通过这样的方式缓解足部的压力，缓解腰部的压力。那随着你慢慢适应之后呢，甚至你可以站到球上去感受到这样更多的、更深层的一个松解。
Now, the key here is if you've been actually watching Jen roll the ball underneath her foot, is that the entire time she's been kind of shifting weight and moving her hip, which means that she's actually moving her spine at the same time. So she's actually getting movement while standing, even though she may not even think about it. And this is one of the things that you want to be able to do with clients, is trick them into doing what you want by doing something else.
还有一个非常重要的点，就是在你踩球的同时，你可能都没有意识到，随着你脚的滚动，你的整个脊柱都在产生动作。所以这是我们希望客户去做到，就是我们一直会有一些运动，不要让它维持在一个静态状态。那这个时候我们肌肉就会更好的发力。
So there's several other tools that you can use. I know at my office specifically, I have a rock mat. So I actually have a small little padded mat that has a whole bunch of these little ridges on it, and I walk on that. So I basically am just standing there shifting side to side, because you can't really stand in one spot for too long or else it gets very uncomfortable in the bottom of the foot. So it forces me to keep moving. Another option as well is to put a half foam roller. So it's think about a full-sized foam roller, and it's cut in half lengthwise. And if you put that down, you can stand on it. You can do calf stretches. You can balance on it by turning it straight. Think about anything that you might have available to you that'll allow you or your client to just keep moving while standing.
对，其实还有很多的选择可以帮助你实现这个目的啊，就是让它一直动。比如说，我会用一个上面会有凹凸不平的这个类似地毯。所以它会有很多的凸起，我无法在一个位置长时间站立，因为会带来明显的这个不适感。那另外一个选择呢，就是大家见过泡沫轴，你可以把它切开，把一个半轴放在地上，所以你可以一边做小腿段的拉伸，一边在站立办公，然后你可以两边做交替，可以确保自己可以一直会变换你的姿态，变换你的站姿。
All right, so now that we've talked about proper posturing for a fairly long time, obviously you know it's pretty important, but there's a few other areas that are important as well for your client. So the next one is daily movement. And when you think about joints in your body, and a lot of the research that's been done, in order for a joint to maintain health and to get nutrients in and waste out, there has to be movement. So it needs compression and it needs actual movement or oscillation.
好，刚刚我们花了很多时间来聊这个姿势啊，因为姿势对于我们现代生活来说非常重要。那么接下来我们讨论一下第二个话题，就是日常活动。因为会有非常多的研究显示，如果我们想要一个关节更健康，那这个关节需要一些运动。这运动有可能包括一些压力啊，包括一些环绕，所以确保它可以把营养物质吸收进来，把代谢废物去排出去。
Now, we've talked about a little bit about decompression already, in the sense that what we're trying to do is counteract the compressive force of gravity. So we're trying to basically pull apart that spine a little bit and take some of that compression off, because those discs themselves, we don't want them to compress too much over extended periods of time. We want that movement and that health. So if we squeeze out all of the nutrients and all of the water out of the discs, they actually become unhealthy, they become brittle, and you can start to have other issues in the spine.
好，所以第一个点会是一个减压啊，我们希望减少两节椎骨之间椎间盘的这个压力。刚刚的伸展也是基于这个原则。那当我们的这个椎骨如果可以得到一定的拉伸、一定的压力释放的时候，那可以更多的营养、更多的水分回到椎间盘，那允许更大的活动范围。所以这个是我们希望可以完成的。
And so for this, there's a few different ways. I showed you a couple that a client can do at the office, or that you can do while maybe in a sitting position. But the ideal is for them to be able to hang. Hanging is something that we have almost always done, and it's something that we should all be able to do, yet some of us might not be able to do. But we want to work towards about 20 minutes, 10 to 20 minutes of hanging every single day. And by hanging, all I mean is it can either be on a pull-up bar and you're actually holding your whole weight, or it could even be in a doorway where you're just holding the top and just bending your knees a little bit, just to try to get a little bit of decompression in that spine.
好，所以刚刚我们尝试了在坐姿状态向上伸展、向前伸展，这都是一个减压的方式。但实际上这还不够透彻，比较理想的状态是我们希望客户可以做到一个悬吊啊，无论是你找到一个引体向上的单杠去做一个悬吊，还是你只是吊在门上啊，完成一个屈膝，都可以很好的缓解你整个脊柱、整个椎间盘的这样一个压力。所以我们希望的是可以通过一点点练习，最终累积到每天悬吊20分钟。
Now, if a client can't get overhead, either due to pain or maybe range of motion of the shoulder, they can do the same thing maybe on a vertical doorstop where they hold on, and hopefully you can see this, where they hold on to something and then allow themselves to pull, right? So they can do it in an actual door jamb itself. Or if they're at work They can go either to their desk, or I'm going to use the back of the chair here. And all they'll do is bring their hands to the chair, and they're just going to let themselves kind of like slouch down a little bit. So they're going to try to prop themselves up on the chair or on the desk and allow their hips to sag down so that they're pulling or allowing the hip weight to pull that spine apart.
好，那会有些客户他可能会无法完成这样一个过顶或者是存在肩部的疼痛。那我们给到大家2个替代的一个方案。第一个就像刚刚 Adam 演示的，我的手可以抓在门把手上，然后让我的脊柱尽可能做到一个延伸，或者是在办公场所用一个凳子。那你需要做的呢是把你的手撑在椅背上，那撑住你的肩关节之后呢，让你的身体整个向下坠。所以整个感觉会是用你下肢的力量来把整个脊柱拉长，从而得到一个减压。那这2个动作都可以避免你的手需要在过顶位可以达到同样的效果。
And so as I said, about 10 to 20 minutes is what you want to work up to in total. So not all at one time, that's just a little bit crazy, but maybe 30 seconds at a time, maybe up to a minute at a time. And it could be whether you're on the back of a bench, on the table, on a countertop, maybe you're just hanging from one side or up above, and just working towards getting a little bit more hanging and decompression into the spine throughout your day, as I said, to fight that effect of gravity.
好，所以我们整个这个悬挂的目的就是为了对抗重力，大家可以通过1天多次来完成，那不可能一次悬吊20分钟，所以我们可以每半个小时起来支撑一下。每1个小时起来支撑一下，最终累积到1天接近20分钟的这样一个时间，去缓解重力给你整个脊柱关节上带来的这样一个压力。
Now, the next one is brisk walking, and this is something that hopefully you've been doing more and more lately. Hopefully you do this already, but a lot of clients don't really brisk walk. They walk, but often they walk slowly, and walking slowly is actually not as good for your back as walking quickly.
那第2个要素是我们需要快走那非常希望的是你已经有这样的习惯，客户已经有这样的习惯。那如果你平时你走的会比较慢，那么相对快走来说，慢速行进对于脊柱没有太大的帮助。
And so with this, the reason why we want to brisk walk, and by brisk, I mean a quick walk, is because the reciprocal motion of the upper and lower body. Now, I'm going to exaggerate it a bit, but as you step forward and you rotate, you actually get a twisting motion in the spine and in the hips. And that actually allows to ease some of the tension that the muscles may be feeling by getting a bit of a stretch into the front of the hip, getting some good hip extension, but also helps to lubricate the hips and the spine as well.
那为什么快走会有这个好处呢？刚刚会是一个相对有点夸张的演示就当你需要做一个对侧模式，并且加速的时候，你的身体就会出现一个在左旋跟右旋之间的交替。那这个交替的旋转可以起到很好的作用，就是润滑你的髋关节，润滑你的脊柱，所以这个时候可以起到一些缓解压力并且让它变得更加健康的这样一个效果。
And so you want to do a minimum of 60 minutes of brisk walking spread throughout your day. And you typically want to try to have different terrains, different elevations. So maybe you're going not just on like a flat concrete surface, but maybe some grass, some hills, some dirt, maybe in a forest, and trying to get different motions in the foot, hips, and the spine that will help lubricate it even better.
我们希望的是1天可以达到60分钟的这个快走的时间。那更理想的是你可以在不同的地面状态下行进，比如说我们可以在草地上行进在土地上，或者是在这个丛林里。如果你需要高低上下让你的脚去适应不同的这个环境，那会有更好的这样一个效果。
So with this, in general, just think about it this way. Wherever you walk, no matter where you're walking, whether it's in your office or outside, walk quickly, not because you're in a hurry, but because you want to maintain back health.
这件事的改变非常容易，就是从今天开始，你只要记住，无论你是从办公室走去洗手间，还是从哪里走到哪里，2个点之间，你这个行进把速度加快，不是因为你在赶时间，而是因为你知道快走对你的整个脊柱会有好处。
And so the last piece here for daily movement is you want to have your spine go through full active range of motion every single day. So meaning that we want to have our spine go into rotation fully on both sides, flexion, extension, and lateral flexion as well, just to make sure that we get all the different end ranges hit so that we don't start losing range of motion in our spine.
最后一个是我们希望主动进行全活动度下的这个运动，那意味着我们脊柱需要左旋、右旋、屈曲、伸展、侧屈，所以你尽可能在一个最大活动度下去每天进行一些训练，维持这样一个运动的能力。
So notice here that it says active range of motion, not passive. So I'm not talking about when you're sitting in your chair, whether in your car or at the office, and you kind of grab onto your chair and you reef to the side to try to crack your back. That's not active range of motion, that's passive. So we actually want to I like bringing my arms across my chest and allowing myself to rotate with my entire spine. So trying to get motion where I want it from the thoracic spine and the cervical spine, and then I'm going to go the opposite way as well, and maybe even taking a couple breaths at end range in rotation there.
那需要注意的是，这个是一个主动的行为啊。那刚刚 Adam 的示范就是你可能坐在凳子上，用手抓住把手，然后拼命的把自己的脊柱向一侧去旋，这个叫被动啊。我们不希望做被动，有可能造成这个扭伤。那我们需要比较理想的方式呢，是把双手在胸前交叉。在你能够控制的情况下，完成最大幅度的旋转，胸椎旋、颈椎旋、腰椎也可以伴随一定的旋转。那甚至你会在动作末端去保留几次呼吸啊，去强化一下这个活动度。
And then something that you can add to that rotation is you can actually rotate and then have yourself laterally flex slightly, take a breath into the opposite side that's opening up, and then what you'll notice is you're actually able to rotate a little bit further, and then you can go a little bit more, and you just kind of work your way around there, really breathing as you go, and then you can go to the opposite side and do the same thing, but you're now adding both rotational, so transverse plane movements, and a little bit of frontal plane movement as well.
我们还可以做的是脊柱的这个组合运动啊，就是在你旋转的基础上做一些侧屈，一边旋转一边侧屈，配合着呼吸。所以这个时候我们不光做了一个水平面脊柱的运动，加上了一个额状面的一个运动。
And then now we just have to add some sagittal plane movement into this. And I like to call this the wave. I often do this standing, which I will show you in a minute. But this is very simple. All you're trying to do is basically pull each piece of your spine and roll it like a wave. So just rolling the cervical, thoracic, and then lumbar spine as you sit in the chair. So just trying to get a little bit of motion actively into that spine to lubricate it up.
所以刚刚我们做了水平面跟额状面，那现在我们是一个矢状面的动作，叫做脊柱波浪。按照 Adam 的示范，就坐在凳子上，你会想着自己每一节椎都在主动的产生动作，让整个脊柱像在产生一个波浪一样啊，来回的去完成运动，这个会更好的润滑你的每一个关节。
And so I just showed you those sitting because a lot of clients are probably going to be sitting most of the day. And so they can do that while sitting, but you can also do all of those while standing as well. You just take away the chair and you use your feet as the stationary point. And so if I would just rotate and I can take a couple breaths if I just want to do some rotational movement, some transverse plane movement, but I can also add it to the same piece that I was using as well with the frontal plane movements as well. And then I can do my wave in the same kind of manner, just trying to get some motion into the spine in that sagittal plane.
所以刚刚示范的是一个坐姿版本啊，因为更多客户可能是长期处在坐姿状态。那同样，当我们站起来之后，也可以做一样的动作，旋转加上侧屈。或者是我们在矢状面完成脊柱波浪，这时候我们不用凳子来作为一个稳定的基底，而是靠我们的双脚站在地面上。
Now, what I just showed you was some open kinetic chain movement with the spine in that, the head or the hands were not connected to anything. But I'm going to bring Jen out just to show you a couple closed chain pieces that you can do as well with your clients. If perhaps they have some back pain, it might be difficult to have them doing those motions in a standing position. Closed chain is going to represent a bit more of a controlled and stable position for them.
所以刚刚示范的是两个开练的几个开练的动作，就意味着你的头没有被固定，你的手没有去支撑，所以这个是一个开练动作。那有的时候你的客户如果他有下背痛，或者他相对来说活动幅度没有这么大，那开练会是比较挑战。接下来我们会请Jenny来示范几个闭练下的这个脊柱运动。
So what I'm going to get Jen to do is we're going to get down into a quadruped position. So just onto the knees and the hands. And the key here is that the hands are right underneath the shoulders. The knees are going to be right underneath the hips. And this is a nice stable position for the spine. This is actually the second position that we would get somebody after the back if they have something like back pain.
所以这是有一个四足支撑位，你的手会在肩正下方，膝盖会在髋部正下方。那这个位置在脊柱的对脊柱是非常友好的，所以当一个客户有下背痛的时候，这会是我们比较建议他在的一个位置。
So we're going to do our sagittal plane movement first. And instead of just having our client just go up as high as they can into flexion and then down as far as they can into extension, instead I'm going to have them drive everything from the pelvis. So we're first going to go into flexion. So we're going to actually posteriorly pelvic tilt, and we're going to let everything rise up nice and far. Head's going to come down. Right? So I'm going to get a good motion here, and then the pelvis is going to go into extension, and everything else is going to follow as I go. But the pelvis is going to drive all of that motion in the spine, because I don't want the spine to get used to moving itself.
还记得我们前面讲的，我们整个体态都会是由骨盆的状态所影响，所以这个动作我们希望以骨盆的动作作为一个领导者，所以先用骨盆后倾来带动整个脊柱屈，再转化为骨盆前倾变成一个脊柱的这样一个伸展。
And then the next thing that we're going to do as well is just get some thoracic spine motion. So from here, she's actually going to sit back onto her heels. She's going to bring her hands just to the front of her knees, so her palms are still on the ground. So I'm still able to maintain a nice flat back position. And we're going to grab one hand, so we'll just use the right hand for right now. We'll bring it to the back of the neck. And all she's going to do from here is she's going to open up, and then she's going to bring her elbows together. So she's going to try to bring this elbow towards the other elbow to get rotation in the opposite direction. So this is now active range of motion, but in a closed chain position.
对，现在这个动作是在闭练下的一个主动胸椎的旋转。我们首先让训练者的重心向后屁股可以接近坐在脚跟上，确保整个脊柱的这个延展。然后我们会把一侧手放在脑后，主动的向上，让他的手肘去指向天空，然后再向下，让手肘碰到另外一侧的手肘，所以主动做一个胸椎的旋转动作。
Right, so you're going to want to make sure that because the entire spine is connected, that when you're rotating in that thoracic spine, we're allowing the eyes to look, because most often when you are doing, outside of probably sport, most of the time when you move, your eyes lead everything else. So your eyes, your neck, and then the thoracic spine moves, and then the rest of your body turns as well. So we're letting the eyes lead kind of where that thoracic spine is going as you rotate out in that transverse plane.
所以当我们在水平面做胸椎旋转的时候，我们希望的是可以由视线来引领这个动作，因为在绝大多数的情况下，我们的身体会随着你的视线转移，然后颈椎跟着转，胸椎跟着转，所以这是一个更自然、更具有功能性的动作模式。
All right, so that is kind of how to use some active full range of motion throughout your day, whether it be open chain or closed chain, and just helps you maintain the range of motion that you have and lubricate the joints specifically in the spine. Now, if you have a client who has pain, make sure that we avoid end range if they have pain in those areas. So we're going to stick to the painless range, so the pain-free range of motion.
好，所以刚刚讲的是我们通过开练或者闭练的主动脊柱运动来维持一个比较良好的活动度。那这个情况会有个特例，就是当你的客户已经有下背痛的时候，我们会 避免做到最大的幅度。或者简单来说，我们会做无痛运动。
So, daily movement, posture, and now we're going to talk about just really quickly optimizing our lifting mechanics. And most of the time when we're teaching exercises, we focus a lot on the range of motion that the person is able to go. But here I want you to really think about, well, what is the position of the spine in all of those movements? And how do I not only set the spine in a good position, but how do I ensure that the spine isn't what is driving the motion? So I just want to give you a few things to look at, and then we'll talk about some exercise variations that will help maintain the health of that spine.
最后我们来聊一下在训练时候一个比较理想的这个发力机制。我们经常会强调动作要做全幅度，但全幅度的同时，我们其实需要关注脊柱这样一个状态，是不是从开始就维持一个很良好的良好的曲度。所以接下来会从几个点给大家分享一些你需要关注的这个细节或者是训练的动作，来让做到更好的这个在负重状态下脊柱的健康。
All right, so I'm just going to bring Jen back out here. And so when we're thinking about start position, the key here is to make sure that we are setting the spine up in a good position so it's able to not only have muscular control, but also able to fully support the loads that I'm going to place on it, whether it's a front squat, back squat, a deadlift, whatever it is. I need to be able to control the motion in that spine.
好，首先是起始位置我们需要的是在训练开始之前很好的调整好你脊柱的状态，无论你是做一个后蹲、一个前蹲、一个硬拉，你都应该有足够的肌肉的力量去控制脊柱的状态。
And so for this, regardless of whether it is a squat, a deadlift, a lunge, a step up, any of those lower body exercises, or maybe even a standing press of some sort, I'm going to get the feet positioned where I want them. So in this case, we'll just do a bilateral pattern with the feet straight. And then the key here is just to make sure that we get a nice long spine position and we utilize that pelvis to adjust the amount of curve in that lower back, depending on where maybe the client feels some pain or what the loading is going to be like.
所以首先我们无论是做一个这个深蹲、硬拉、弓步，还是任何一种下肢动作，我们需要的是双脚非常稳定的踩实在地面，然后我们会通过骨盆的前倾或后倾来调整整个脊柱曲度的状态。那比如说有的时候客户过度屈的时候就会出现下背痛，那我们会通过骨盆向后旋转去把这个曲度调回来一点。
All right, so we're just going to position the pelvis. We want it right in line with the shoulders. I'm going to get her to bring the upper body forward just a little bit, shoulders back, there we go. So we want a nice flat lower back or a little bit of lumbar curve there, right? So what we would term as neutral spine, but understanding that every single client is going to have a little bit of a different position. There's no set one position. It's the position one that is pain-free and two where there's the most amount of movement on all the other sides.
好，所以我们会通过这个调整找到一个中立位。但这个中立位其实会有点因人而异因为每个人他的自然曲度不一样，所以我们需要找到的是，第一个，它会在一个良好的曲度下；第二个是呢，它可以允许无论是屈还是伸都有一定的活动空间，不会在它的动作的最大幅度。
And then from here, we want to make sure that we're set up with good spinal stability, because the reality is if I was to load Jen right now, you see how she buckles at the hips, the upper body flops back. So I want to make sure that she's set and ready so that when we pick up the load or we place the load on the spine, that once that load comes, she's stable and nothing really moves underneath it.
我们需要做到一点就是当你比如说把你的手放在客户的肩膀上向下压的时候，应该没有被这个压力产生进一步的曲度变化，这意味着它的整个核心应该是收紧，构建一个很好的这个腹内压。所以在后面再次尝试的时候，发现 Adam 向下压，但 Jane 的整个腰椎曲度没有变化，骨盆没有任何的动作。
Now with number 2 and 3 here, so the tissue loading sequence as well as the available range of motion, all I want to make sure is that I am loading the muscles that are going to be used first. So in most lower body exercises, I want the glutes first and then the quads after, or maybe the hamstrings after. but I also want to make sure that I'm utilizing only the range of motion where I can maintain a nice neutral spine.
所以第二个点跟第三个点，我们来依次讨论一下。首先是一个正确的负重顺序。以下肢训练为例，那我们无论是蹲还是拉，那都应该是臀部先去启动，然后跟上可能是股四，可能是腘绳。那还有第三点非常重要的是，我们希望可以达到它能够控制的关节活动度。那么意味着它在这个活动度下，它的脊柱是没有曲度变化的。
But the key here is actually number 4, in that I am making sure that I'm initiating the movement from the right position. Because if you think about squats and deadlifts specifically, oftentimes those two exercises, when we get down, we may have a good start position, we may load properly, we may utilize only our available range of motion, but we don't allow the spine to maintain its position. And instead we might use the erectors in something like a deadlift in order to create either tension or the force to get up out of the bottom position.
其实还有一个很重要的点是第4个，就是动作的启动发力。比如说以我们的深蹲跟硬拉为例，我们可能做到了很好的起始位置，构建好了很好的腹内压，很好的承重状态，向下的过程也是正确的。但最后发力起来的时候，可能会借助你的竖脊肌去代偿完成一定的这个发力。所以这个时候，当它收紧的时候，你的脊柱和你的骨盆一定会产生预先的一些动作。
So we're just going to utilize both the squat and the deadlift. We're just going to do like 2 repetitions, one good repetition and then one poor repetition that you would commonly see. So you know kind of what you're looking for in these 2 big movements. So we're going to do the Romanian deadlift or the traditional deadlift first. And so I'm just going to have slight bend in the knees. We're going to hinge at the hips to come down. So let's just imagine all the way down. Let's go. Okay. So let's imagine that we had a good start sequence. We had a good tissue loading sequence. We're only utilizing good range of motion, but often in the deadlift, one of 2 things will happen. Most commonly, they'll actually keep the bar where it is. They'll roll up like this, and then they'll come up to the top. And so they're using a lot of the stretch into the erectors. The abdominals are actually pulling that rib cage down. And this is putting a lot of stress specifically onto the posterior discs, which is going to potentially lead to a bulged disc or herniated disc later on down the road.
好，所以刚刚的这个动作我们来理解一下。那我们假设我们做到了很好的起始位，很好的离心控制，所以会下放到一个末端幅度并且在腰椎保持稳定，达到了一个它能实现的最大活动度。但起来的时候，很多人会出现一个动作，就是杠铃会正常轨迹向上，但是由于它借助了竖脊肌的发力，核心过度的收紧，把肋骨向下拉，会变成一个出现弓背的状态。那这个弓背的状态其实会给整个身体后侧的这个椎间盘非常大的压力。那这个压力如果长期不去调整，或者是长期做类似这样的训练，有可能造成椎间盘突出，类似这样的这个损伤。
And so I'm just going to show you now a good hip hinge, a good deadlift. So going down the same way, we had a good setup position, good tissue loading sequence, good available range of motion. But now we're just watching to make sure the spine stays in its good position, and we initiate from the hips and everything comes up at the same time. So I'm able to maintain good, stable position here in the core. So spine maintains its position, and the hips, which are the biggest muscle in the body, the glutes, are able to actually initiate that movement from the bottom.
所以刚刚示范的是一个非常正确的这个硬拉，在你整个脊柱保持曲度不变、很好的核心张力的同时，靠身体的这个臀部去启动，完成伸髋动作。
And then the same thing happens in the squat as well. So we're going to just use a high bar back squat as our example. So I'm just going to get Jen just to widen her feet just a little bit here. And so same thing. Let's imagine we've got a good start position. The tissue loading sequence is good as we sit back. She sits into that bottom of that squat. And often what you'll see is the person will overarch their lower back as they stand up in that position. So they're actually utilizing the erectors a lot to help to stabilize that lower back and that pelvis so that they can use a lot of quad in that position. So you'll see this erectors will actually start to lift out of that position. So instead, what we want to see is that in the same way, good tissue loading sequence, good, sit down into that squat. And instead of seeing this back move, we want to see the hips initiate the movement and the spine maintains its position.
好，跟它一样，我们来看一下一个高杠深蹲。那我们可以做到很好的负重下蹲到底，但起来的时候，很多人会借助他的竖举肌去维持这个腰椎的曲度和骨盆，所以这个时候它可以更多让骨四发力，但你就会出现它其实大部分人他的曲度腰椎曲度会变大，所以这个时候同样会给下背很大的压力。那一个比较正确的动作呢，应该是在整个启动的过程中，你的脊柱没有曲度变化，靠臀部完成向上的伸髋动作。
So there's many other things that we could talk about, like with regards to optimizing lifting mechanics in both the squat and the deadlift. If you're interested in learning more about those, I do have 2 other sessions specifically on addressing the squat and the foundations of the hip hinge, which go through the same sequence in more detail. So you can check those out. But we've kind of come to the end. We've come to the end of our time together. So all I want to say is thank you to each and every one of you for tuning in, for listening, for supporting Idea China, and for just demonstrating a desire and a passion for not only learning and continued learning, but also for your clients and getting them the best results you can.
好，那如果关于这个在训练中如何更好的启动或者更好的完成一个比较最佳的发力，那其实 Adam 还有另外2节课，一节课会讲深蹲模式，一节课会讲屈髋模式，所以大家可以根据 Adam 课程时间进行学习。那由于今天的时间关系呢，那我们即将来到课程的尾声，那还是非常感谢各位同学你在自己的职业生涯上，在自己的专业度上的投入，为了你客户能够得到更好的服务，来投入自己的这个时间。
I once again want to thank Idea China, and I want to thank Lee for just being great and putting all of this together. There's been a lot of work that's went into this, especially having to move all of this online versus being in person. And then Arthur as well, thank you for interpreting. And I just want to say I really hope that I can see you next year in China and work with all of you in person. If you have any questions, you can feel free to contact me. My contact information is on the screen. Email is adam@connectedperformance.ca. That's my website where you can find a lot of useful tips and some other materials. And then my Instagram, my Facebook, and my Twitter all utilize that same Kinetic PRFM handle.
好，那最后再次感谢我们的 idea 大会组以及我们的负责人，给到大家这样一个线上学习的机会。非常希望明年有机会在中国跟各位面对面的交流。那如果听完今天的课或者其他课程之后有任何的问题，随时欢迎能够跟我取得联系。比如说我们的 email 地址会是在第1行呈现，那我的官网会在第2行。那无论是 Instagram 还是 Twitter 还是 Facebook 都会以第3个这个名称来呈现在社交媒体上，所以欢迎各位能够来寻求更多的信息，寻求更多的交流。
Thank you.
感谢各位。Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.